back to the Culture More podcast. I'm your host, Cassandra Perez, and this is episode 9, where we're going to be talking about how to be a resilient person, which is one of my favorite topics to talk about because I love learning how to be more resilient in the face of adversities, because that's something that life does surely promise us. We can't really avoid that. So I love learning and then teaching others how to face this life in a stronger and more enduring way so that we don't get crumbled by the trials of life, which are always going to come, are always going to be in our path, unfortunately. But resiliency is that one thing that can help us really make it through every single time and come out successful and come out learning even more. And so the past couple of podcasts that I've filmed have been more psychology based, but today I really want to talk about one of my favorite stories, and his name is Joseph. And he's actually the first person that I thought of when I was writing or even just brainstorming this podcast title. His life literally shows how to be a resilient person. And if you don't know the story, I'm definitely going to go over it later in the podcast. But if you want to read the story, which I really invite you to, the Bible is so fascinating. It's so beautiful, and it's never boring at all. It's actually the opposite of that. So his story is found in Genesis chapter 37 through 50. But before we get started with all of that, I want to briefly define and explain what resiliency means and what that concept is all about. So resiliency is our ability to cope in the face of adversity, stress, or trauma. A resilient person is able to bounce back, survive, recover, and get up stronger through difficult times. Resilience is a learned skill. So that's why I'm making this podcast, because you can just learn how to be a more resilient person. So anyone can develop it, and it's something that comes with the supernatural strength of God that's poured into you. And one of the most beautiful things about humans is that we're made to last and to endure. As someone who's in the field of psychology, I've read through the worst abuse stories I will ever probably come across, and people have still managed to survive and live a better life after living and experiencing what they went through, especially as children. And this has always shocked me. I will never not be amazed at how we're able to make it through the worst things that we thought were going to kill us, but it has actually made us who we are and has made us to become even stronger people. I was even thinking about how we're all born into an environment where we're already ready to absorb shock if it were to happen. And the reason I say this is because I was thinking about even babies in the womb. They're surrounded by this amniotic fluid that is actually made to absorb any potential traumas to the fetus. So right as we're conceived, we're already starting to prepare for the hardships that may come even in the womb, which I actually think that's pretty cool, but also funny. And we're literally wired for any what ifs of life. It's actually pretty miraculous, and that's why scientists are so fascinated with the human body, because it's made by such a supernatural and wise and perfect creator who thought about everything. And this is all great news to our physical body that's able to endure, but what about translating that resiliency over to our mental and emotional well-being? Because the key part of resilience is learning to accept emotional pain and stress as a part of life, and reminding yourself that negative experiences and emotions will pass or become easier to manage over time. So we need to be able to see challenges, mistakes as an opportunity to learn and grow. We can't let the trials of life allow us to crumble, because the tragic part of life is that the world doesn't stop for us. I remember a teacher a long time ago, she told us that, and I'm like, wow, that's like the saddest news I've ever heard, but it's the truth. It's the hard truth of the world and how it operates. It's like the world doesn't really care. The world doesn't stop spinning. So that means we have to learn how to keep going. While we suffer, we have to learn to keep running when it hurts. And that's resilience. It's the ability to keep moving and pushing forward when all else seems to be against us. We have to learn to be flexible in situations that we can't control. We have to go with the flow and let things go. Don't allow things to get to you. We have to be agreeable. We have to be patient. We have to let certain things go in order to keep our mind focused on our goals and aspirations. Because when you become rigid, you risk being unable to adapt to your circumstances in order to surpass them. I often think about how many people harden their hearts because of life events that were really unfair, which, yes, it's valid to address how hard it is and how difficult it is. But when we harden ourselves and when we become rigid, and especially when we stay there, we do not allow ourselves to then be moldable into what the new season expects of us. We can't fit into the new season with the anger that we're holding on to, with the broken heart, with anything. We have to be able to heal that, let that go, and keep moving forward. And I always like examples. So I always like to think about how I love summer so much. Spring and summer, they're one of my favorite seasons. But if I were to grasp onto that so tightly, that I wear the same outfits that I wear in the summer, I do the same activities that I do in the summer, and I just have such a hard time letting go of that. I'm not going to be prepared for the cold Chicago winters. I'll actually probably freeze to death if I keep wearing the same things that I wear in the summer. So I have to adapt myself. I have to change several things of my life in order to prepare for what's next. And a lot of us don't know that preparation is part of resiliency. You're preparing for what's next. You're preparing and learning how to cope with what's right in front of you and how to keep walking through it. And I know that sometimes when, things happen to us and we get really upset, we like to hold on to anger because it fools us into thinking that that's how we're going to get control over the situation. But sometimes it's actually setting us up to delay our healing and our ability to move forward. There's never nothing wrong with being angry over something, but it's when we act on that anger that unfortunately it paralyzes us and doesn't allow us to mature into who we need to become. We should all be in constant pursuit of searching for new ways to conquer our goals in the midst of adversity. We have to keep swimming or else we'll drown. And if you stay in the same spot and decide to float, the current of life is going to take you, and it's going to take you unintentionally. You're not even going to know how you ended up where you ended up because you're not choosing the hardship of continuing to swim against the current even until you reach your next destination. And I know it's so much easier for us to complain about what's going on in our life, but we should actually start reverting that energy that we use to complain into actually making a difference if we can and with what we can. I've learned that many times Satan doesn't have to work very hard to destroy our faith, because we do so well at destroying our own faith with our tongue and how we decide to use our tongue in the face of adversity. We can choose to talk negatively, to complain all the time, instead of speaking life over what's happening and being resilient. Maintaining a hopeful outlook and looking for the good in every single difficult situation has made such a difference in my own personal life. And I've started to ask myself, what is God trying to teach me in this moment, instead of why is God doing this to me? Or I'll also just talk to myself and soothe myself by saying something good will come out of this. Just keep going, just keep going. Sometimes we have to sit down and talk to us as if we were little children and just soothe ourselves with words that are affirming, with words that are encouraging, because I'm sure that there's someone listening that doesn't even have people to cheer them on in the midst of adversity. But you can be your own cheerleader. God gave you a mouth for a reason. He gave you a brain for a reason, so that you can pull from the truth and you can speak wisdom over yourself and life over yourself. And another key thing to do when we are in the midst of a trial is to practice gratitude and to be unaffected by the negativity of others. Sometimes a whole group is hit with the same adversity all at once, and this could be a group of coworkers, it could be your friends, it could be your family, and you might be the only one who's able to maintain resilience. We need to carry ourselves differently, and that might even be carrying yourself differently within your own family. Because how will you inspire others to keep going if all you use your mouth for is to complain about the situation? We have this natural search for life, for motivation, for inspiration. We're constantly looking to see where we can get that, where we can fill our cup from. And it's definitely challenging, but I challenge you to operate differently when the next adversity strikes in your life. And so I was actually just going through this topic in one of my classes, and we had to read this research article that was done on resilience. And the study was looking at a group of children who endured violent abuse. And two of those groups that experienced the same things came out extremely different, polar opposites. One succeeded in life and the others didn't. They noticed that the ones who succeeded in life and still were able to keep going were people who actually were provided a lot of love and caring support. So although they had been through all of this trauma, what marked their resilience was the community that surrounded them and the family that surrounded them that helped them continue on in life. So, if you're facing something that's very hard, a traumatic experience, I want to encourage you to know when it's time to ask for support and connect yourself to a community so that they can uplift you when you've lost all of your hope and all of your desire to keep going. And this study makes so much sense because I've even seen it in my life compared to the life of my friends. Some of my friends didn't grow up, with two parents in the house, with a loving community around them. And I can definitely see how they endure challenges much differently than I did because I was connected to a family who supported me and was able to guide me through the hardships of life. And it just goes to show how important family is, how important being a healthy human being so that you can grow a healthy family for yourself in the future. It's so important to do the hard work now because who knows what your children will endure in the future. And if you don't know how to support yourself, how are you going to know how to support another person? It all starts with you. And if maybe you have a friend that's going through a hard time, encourage them to plug into a small group, encourage them to go to church, encourage them to stay within community. And a lot of times that's the last thing that we want to do, especially when we're going through hard things. But again, like this research article showed, that it was definitely one of the defining markers of these children who went through the most violent and horrendous things. And the reason why some were able to make it is because of the love that built that strong foundation for them to become something later in life. All right, so now we're going to talk about the story of Joseph. And if you're listening and have never heard or read anything about this story, I want to encourage you to be patient and listen through the whole podcast because at the end, the revelations that I received are absolutely extraordinary. And I'm going to briefly summarize it for you. So, again, just stay with me and don't click out of the podcast just yet. But there's also a really great animation movie called Joseph the King of Dreams. I think it's available on YouTube, Amazon Prime, maybe even Netflix. It's a really good portrayal of Joseph's life, and I think it's pretty accurate. I think only a few things are a little bit off. But okay, so Joseph in the Old Testament was the son of Jacob and his wife Rachel. And mind you, Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. And for a long time, Joseph was the youngest out of 11 brothers. Joseph was the most beloved of Jacob's sons. He was Jacob's favorite because obviously he also came from his favorite wife. And so this caused Joseph to be hated and envied by his brothers. Joseph's dad gifted him a beautiful robe of many colors, which again added to the jealousy of his brothers and just grew the anger even more. And when Joseph was about 17 years old, he had a dream that he was gathering grain in the fields with his brothers. And Joseph's bundle of grain stood tall while his brothers' bundles of grain bowed down to Joseph's. And when Joseph told his brothers about this dream, they were so enraged with him. And later, Joseph continued to have more dreams. And in the second one, he dreamt that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. And so Joseph again told his family about this dream, and the dream kind of made it seem that Joseph would one day rule over the family. So you can just imagine how that made his brothers feel. Definitely not happy at all. And so some of Joseph's brothers wanted to plot to kill him. So they went ahead and took Joseph's coat and threw Joseph in a pit. And while Joseph was in a pit, his brothers saw some travelers going to Egypt. Then the brothers decided to sell Joseph as a slave to the travelers for 20 pieces of silver. So imagine your brothers literally selling you to slavery. And if you read how brutal the Egyptians were to the slaves, it's pretty horrendous. And the fact that his own brothers sold him just because they were angry and jealous. And again, this is why it's not good to have anger in your heart because of what it can lead you to do. And if you have anger for someone, it's as if you've already murdered them. I believe that's what Jesus said in the New Testament. So it's very serious. And so back to Joseph, I could only imagine as a 17-year-old, he was getting all of these dreams almost as if he had this grandiose favor of God over his life, right? That one day he was going to rule, one day even his own family was going to bow down to him, but all of a sudden he's thrown into a dark pit, left there, then sold into slavery, into a kingdom that he has no idea about because he's never lived in Egypt. So he's already facing so much adversity at such a young age. He must have felt such betrayal and probably sadness for never seeing his mom and dad again. And I was also thinking that he must have been so confused at what God was doing with him because life just took a sudden turn. So he actually gets sold to Potiphar, which was one of the king's ministers. Potiphar was someone with power, and for a while, things actually started going really well for Joseph. Divine success enabled him to find favor in his master's eyes, and so Joseph was appointed head of Potiphar's estate. However, this would not last forever. Attracted by his handsome looks, Potiphar's wife desired to be intimate with him. One day, when no one was looking, I think no one was home either, the wife grabbed Joseph by his garment and demanded for them to be intimate. And thinking quickly, Joseph slid out of his cloak and ran. So basically, he fled the scene because he had bigger fear of the Lord than sleeping with his master's wife. Obviously, this enraged her, and she ended up accusing him of trying to entice her. And so what happens to Joseph? He goes back to prison. So again, it's just so tumultuous, this story of Joseph. And I'm sure we have all gone through seasons of life where it begins to look a little bit good and then it dips back down, and then it's like a hill. We're just riding the wave of life, and it's easy to get really discouraged when we're just riding the wave, and it's just going up and down, up and down. We don't even know in what to trust anymore. And so to cut it short, the king, this is different from Potiphar, the king needed help interpreting some of his dreams. And while Joseph was in prison, there was people in prison with him, and they would dream dreams, and Joseph would interpret their dreams, and some of them got released, and Joseph would be like, don't forget about me, don't forget about me. And I can only imagine he was probably also saying that to God, like, God, don't forget about me. I'm in this dark prison once again. Please don't forget about me. So when the king was needing interpretation of dreams, these ex-prisoners told him, like, oh, I know of someone who's in prison who can actually interpret your dreams very accurately. So Joseph ended up getting released out of prison and accurately interpreting the dreams of the king. And of course, over time, this granted such huge favor over Joseph because Joseph was saving a whole nation from famine and potentially deaths of thousands. This made him become governor over the land, and when there was famine all over the land, his brothers finally came asking Joseph for food, not recognizing him and bowing down to him because he was someone of power now. He was a whole governor. So Joseph's dreams ended up coming true, but he was finally living this blessed life 20 years later because at 17 he got sold. Around age 37 was when he reconnected with his brothers and whole family. And that just goes to show how, unfortunately, things in life can take years and years until we see the sun come out of the situation, but we have to remain strong. We need, that's exactly when we need resiliency the most, to keep going and keep treading through the waters. So then what helped Joseph go from prisoner to prince? So number one, Joseph knew and understood and believed that God was with him the whole time. That's what kept him going, is knowing that the Lord had never left him even through the worst of the worst. And number two, Joseph loved God in a way that was unwavering. It's actually an extraordinary example of how we should trust and love God through the worst times of life, and of course through the good. Number three, it's almost as if Joseph did not know how to keep resentment or bitterness. He did not allow these feelings to rot him away, and he kept going. I just find that incredibly, like, that's a miracle. He literally never let bitterness take a hold of his heart, and he never let these horrible feelings impact him in such a way that it stopped him from later receiving the blessing of God. Number 4, Joseph knew that freedom meant forgiveness. So I'm sure that the reason why he never got bitter is because he continued to forgive, and that falls under the umbrella of being resilient. We have to, how can we keep going if we're chained up to the past or to the event that just occurred in our life? We have to forgive and we have to release those chains and keep going. And number 5, he believed that every adversity was a catalyst event in his life. He knew that God had a plan for his life. So he took every basically punch of life as something that was training him up to face even bigger things in the future. That's how he interpreted all the hardships. And the last and most important thing out of all of these points is, it's actually probably the number one reason behind developing resilience and endurance. And that is believing that your life was not an accident, including the bad. So believing that you're still meant for a bigger purpose than the bad that you're encountering right now. My pastor actually highlighted these verses to support this, and it actually brought me to tears when I was reading Joseph's response to his brothers, because I was just in such awe of his character, of this man who was once a teenage boy sold into slavery just because his brothers were jealous and had to endure so many things that I don't even know in prison, and all of the lonely nights being isolated and just being without his parents for all his life, maybe not even knowing if his dad was still alive, because I think his dad was very old by the time he had him. So even probably battling grief and so many emotions, but he still is able to say this in Genesis chapter 45 verse 6 through 7. Joseph says to his brothers, "And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Like, wow. I don't even know what to say after that. I don't even know how to end my podcast with such a beautiful way to respond to the very people who harmed you. And the reason that he was able to respond this way is because he knew he had a purpose in the midst of adversity. That is what drove him to be a resilient man. It was the faith, unwavering faith and love he had in God, the trust that he had in God, and never forgetting his God-given purpose. And so this is a man that you can learn endless lessons from. And I just pray that we all do a deep dive onto his story, the story of Joseph. It's so much deeper than this. This was just a brief summary and some brief points on how to become resilient, and I'm hoping that this impacted you and can help you as well, because unfortunately we don't know when things are going to come our way, but what we can do is we can prepare ourselves and build our foundation on solid rock and not on sinking sand that will wash away when the storms of life hit. So yeah, I know I'm kind of ending this so weirdly, but this was just, Joseph left me speechless. So yeah, I hope that, let me know guys how this podcast impacted you, what you learned from it. Feel free to, on Spotify, you can actually put a little message. You can rate the pod. You can message me on my Instagram at Calls for More Podcast. You can leave a comment on YouTube, hit the like on the video, subscribe. We're almost at 100 subscribers. We're like 24 away. So thank you guys so much for all of your support. And I encourage you guys to continue reading Genesis. With that, I'll catch you on my next episode.